man, stuff just happens here in America. Well, about last night, after more than a year of brain-twisting, reality-bending, you can't make it up plot twists, the 2016 presidential race ended last night with one final tectonic plate shifting 9.5 on the Richter scale earthquake. Hillary Clinton woke up yesterday virtually certain that she was going to be the 45th president of the United States. So did basically the rest of the political world. Instead, this morning, the Democratic nominee thanked a room full of grief-stricken friends and campaign staff members here in New York City, her running mate Tim Kaine at her side, as she publicly conceded the race to Donald J. Trump and wished him well as the soon-to-be leader of the free world.
Donald Trump is going to be our president. We owe him an open mind and the chance to lead. Our constitutional democracy enshrines the peaceful transfer of power. And we don't just respect that, we cherish it. Many of you are at the beginning of your professional, public, and political careers. You will have successes and setbacks too. This loss hurts, but please never stop believing that fighting for what's right is worth it. And to all the women, and especially the young women, who put their faith in this campaign and in me, I want you to know that nothing has made me prouder than to be your champion. And to all the little girls who are watching this, never doubt that you are valuable and powerful and deserving of every chance and opportunity in the world to pursue and achieve your own dreams.
According to the AP, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Arizona are still too close to call. But based on returns in other states that came in during the wee hours of this morning, it looks like Hillary Clinton won the nationwide popular vote, while Donald Trump's unexpected surge in Florida, North Carolina, the Midwest, and the Rust Belt were more than enough to secure 270 electoral votes and send the New York billionaire to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in January. There was an extra cherry on top of Trump's historic night. Republicans held their majorities in the House and Senate, clearing the way for the enactment, potentially, of a bigly GOP agenda next year. Today at the White House, President Obama congratulated Trump for his upset victory and, echoing the president-elect's gracious speech last night, called for the country to unite behind its new leader.
Now, everybody is sad when their side loses an election. But the day after, we have to remember that we're actually all on one team. This is an intramural scrimmage. We're not Democrats first, we're not Republicans first. We are Americans first. We're patriots first. We all want what's best for this country. That's what I heard in Mr. Trump's remarks last night. That's what I heard when I spoke to him directly, and I was heartened by that. That's what the country needs.
So, Mark, you and I were at Hillary Clinton's putative victory party at the Javits Center last night, and we saw the mood shift from festive to apprehensive to tear-soaked and shell-shocked. So my questions for you are twofold. One is, what the hell happened yesterday? And the other is, how did so many people miss it so totally?
I think there are three things. One is, I think people in elite circles just couldn't understand or accept the fact that Trump had a chance to win. Second is, when the incumbent or the quasi-incumbent is below 50, in a normal race, you'd assume that the challenger is going to get a lot of the undecided vote. Right. And I think for some reason people just didn't read the polls that way. Kellyanne Conway and others who worked for Trump kept saying that. She's well below 50. And the last thing is, there's a human element in politics. I kept saying this when these websites that aggregate polls and say, Trump's chances are 13%, all they're doing is looking at polls. They weren't going out, watching the candidates, talking to voters. And if you did that, you saw it was a changed election, and there was one candidate who was talking about fundamental change and one who was a creature of the Washington establishment.
Yeah, I'll push back just on the last point a little bit, just in this sense. Donald Trump got fewer votes in this election than Mitt Romney got 4 years ago. So Hillary Clinton got a lot fewer than Barack Obama got, 7 million fewer than Barack Obama got. So I just want to just focus for a second on some numbers, all right? We talked a lot about her problems with the coalition, the Ascendant. She underperformed Barack Obama significantly with Hispanic voters, even against Donald Trump and all the things he said about Hispanics. She underperformed him predictably with African-American voters. She underperformed him with millennials by a lot. And most importantly, to my mind, the big bulwark against Trump's big coalition of working class voters and rural voters, white voters, was that she was on track, according to every piece of data, public and private, to be the first Democrat in history to win white college-educated voters overall. She failed at that. She was supposed to win it by 20 points, according to every poll, including polling we did. She ended up winning white college-educated women, but losing white college-educated men, and only falling short of the total. So she only improved on Obama with white college-educated voters by 3 points.
Look, the lack of enthusiasm for her, I think, is a big part of the story, and it shows her low number. But again, I think part of the lack of enthusiasm, you saw that against Sanders, you saw it in the general, is people didn't see her as anything but same old establishment figure. And I will say, I cannot prove this yet, and I'm not sure I ever will be, but I think having a lot of the conversation at the end being Comey, on again, off again, on again, off again, whatever, just reinforced people's view that this is just going to be another same old, someone who they didn't want to be in the White House, and I think that depressed her vote with lots of groups.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I agree with you that she suffered from a lack of enthusiasm. All I'm trying to say is that I think that Trump performed really well. His victory was across the board, as we've said. You know, he won all the red states, he won all the battleground states, and he won a few blue states. But his overall performance, again, was not that much better than Mitt Romney's. It was her failure to do what she needed to do with the key elements of what is now the Democratic coalition. That is the story here, and lack of enthusiasm. There are a lot of reasons for that on her side, but that was the core thing. She failed. This was a race for her that she should have won.
Yeah. All right, so that's what happened last night. John previewed some of the numbers that explain the story. Earlier today, we asked our expert pollster, Ann Seltzer, to walk us through the exit polls and dissect in the data how Trump pulled off his victory last night.
So the headline is that Hillary Clinton did not hold on to Barack Obama's coalition that catapulted him into the White House in 2008 and returned him to the White House in 2012. That coalition was youth, minorities, and women. Trump ran up the score with whites and older voters. First, let's look at the young people, and let's take the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Clinton won the under 45 age group, but by just 10 percentage points. Last time around, Barack Obama won that same age group by as much as 20 points. Keep in mind, older voters are more plentiful than younger voters. Next, minorities. Let's look at Florida. That's not bad, but it's not enough when you consider that Trump trounced Clinton by 31 points among Florida's larger white population. In fact, Trump's margin of 31 points blew past Mitt Romney's previous high mark of 24-point victory in 2012. And then there's women. The biggest group of women nationally are, of course, white women, and this is a stunner. Trump won nationally by 10 percentage points among white women. That was more than enough to take away any advantage that Hillary Clinton had with a smaller group of minority women. Finally, our own Bloomberg poll data showed a clue that what happened last night could have been predicted. Just a little nugget in a question that asked about risk. And Republicans nationally saw greater risk in continuing to elect the same kind of candidate over and over. So really, we could see for months that Trump brought together the right coalitions and tapped into the mood of the electorate that was ready for change.
So that's a lot of really key data, and I'll just say, Kellyanne Conway's talked a little bit in making the claim that the Trump data saw a lot of this coming, and they seem confident. it's going to be fascinating. Eventually, I hope someone gets a presentation from I hope it's us, from the Clinton people, because they were equally or maybe even more confident that she was going to win. And I'm desperate to know what calculations they made, because as we say all the time, the campaigns have so much more data than the public media polls. How did they get it so wrong?
Right. I think there's no question that the Trump campaign was doing more with data than a lot of us knew. But I cannot believe that there was not a big disparity between the number of polls done, the sheer volume that the Clinton campaign. You know, back in 2012, we saw, you know, the Obama campaign was basically like building an atomic clock, while, like, you know, the Romney campaign was trying to work with a sundial, right, to measure their vote. Yeah, I felt like that's where the Clinton campaign was, which is part of why, when the Clinton campaign's claims matched up with all the public polling, that's why people like me looked at that and said, steady, durable lead nationally in a lot of the battleground states. Small, but durable. That's what they claimed. That's what the public polling showed. That was why you gave credence to their confidence.
What made no sense to me was, I literally had Clinton people telling me in the last week, we're up by 1 or 2 in Florida, we can't lose. And I would say, 1 or 2? I mean, that's not enough of a margin to deal with the prospect of a Trump surge, which is, at least in Florida, seems to be what happened.
All right, up next, Donald Trump's to-do list. We'll talk about some of the potential names on his administration hiring list when we come right back.
The world is getting its arms around all the giant stories that exist in the wake of Trump's victory. One of the biggest between now and Inauguration Day is, how is Donald Trump going to prepare to assume the office? Part of that process is going to involve building relationships with elected officials in Congress and all over the world. It also means recruiting people to serve in his new administration. One figure who's sure to be key in that is the Vice President-elect Mike Pence, the current governor of Indiana. He's a former member of the House Republican leadership, and he is a man with very good relationships throughout the party, including with some people who Trump has not gotten along with. Other familiar faces have been floated for potential posts in a cabinet or White House of Donald J. Trump, including perhaps Newt Gingrich as Secretary of State, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions as Secretary of Defense, and former mayor of Gotham City, Rudy Giuliani, as Attorney General. The Trump campaign said today that it's going to be releasing his first picks for jobs in about a week. So, John, what is a Trump administration going to look like?
Well, it's going to look not like any other administration we've seen in a long time, in the sense that, these figures, most of those figures up there on the board, apart from Steve Bannon, are familiar figures in Republican politics, but they are not Beltway staples. And so I don't even want to begin to start making predictions about who's going to be in. But one of the interesting things here is that you have for the first genuine populist. Every presidential candidate tries to now become man of the people, right? It's been true for a long time. But Trump ran a genuinely populist outsider campaign, and now he's going to go to this city that he has disdained and try to work within it. And so the question is, how do you maintain that fealty to what got you here, while also putting people into positions that actually know how to run the federal government? It's a big challenge.
I think it's going to have a lot of business people, and most cabinets have 1 or 2 business people. I think there'll be a lot. One of the Democrats' claims in this campaign was Trump is a fraud as a business person. He's failed, the bankruptcies, his businesses are just a big joke. It's going to be fascinating to see if he picks business people. How do they do? Does he have the judgment to put business people in who can actually get stuff done? And what kind of standards do they have? In terms of ethics, in terms of resume, it's going to be fascinating. And like everything we're about to discuss, people have barely thought about this stuff because people didn't think he was going to win and because there's very little to go on because he's never been in elected office. It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah. So how do you feel about the idea of a Treasury Secretary who would go by the name of Mooch?
All good. All good with that.
Okay, great. Weeks ago, amid concern that Donald Trump could be a drag on the Republican House and Senate candidates in this election, Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, freed his Congressional Republican caucus to vote their conscience when it came to supporting their party's controversial nominee. So fast forward to this morning, when Ryan used a post-election press conference to heap unmitigated praise on Donald Trump, giving him credit for the decisive presidential victory that he won last night, and for all of those Republicans running down ballot who he lifted along the way.
This is the most incredible political feat I have seen in my lifetime. Donald Trump heard a voice out in this country that no one else heard. He connected in ways with people no one else did. He turned politics on its head. Our House majority is bigger than expected. We won more seats than anyone expected, and much of that is thanks to Donald Trump. Donald Trump provided the kind of coattails that got a lot of people over the finish line so that we could maintain our strong House and Senate majorities.
So, Mark, we should, before I ask you this question, just a little piece of breaking news, which is that Kelly Ayotte up in New Hampshire has conceded in the New Hampshire Senate race. So that means that Republicans right now have 51 to 47 in the new Senate coming forward. There's still the Louisiana race that's outstanding, but they will not get to 53. Their band now is 51 or 52 now that Kelly Ayotte has lost. So having said that, what do you think we can expect to see from Donald Trump's relationship on Capitol Hill with both Republicans and Democrats?
Well, I mean, one of the criticisms of some in the media and some in the Republican Party when Trump was a candidate was that he was being normalized, that people were talking about him in too normal a way. We saw earlier in the show, President Obama, Hillary Clinton, today the Bushes, Paul Ryan there. People are giving him a chance, and I think his speech last night helped. He's got a chance now. I think, as I said before, Mike Pence is going to be hugely important. And with an all-Republican Congress, I think he's got a chance now to give them the kind of co-equal branch status that Congress has not had under Barack Obama and to some extent under George Bush. There's an opportunity here for him to move a lot of legislation in a hurry because Paul Ryan's got a lot of ideas.
Yeah, there are 2 things that I think are important to keep in mind here. One of them is that, he's still Donald Trump. Right, and he does not take guff. He doesn't like taking guff from these guys. So the likelihood that it's all going to be smooth sailing with some of these congressional leaders is not high, I think, for very long.
Except for the Pence factor.
Except for the Pence factor. But again, he went after Ryan and others along the way. The other thing that everybody just should keep in mind is they think that Trump with a Republican House and Senate means that there's going to be this radical GOP agenda just rammed through. Just remember back to Barack Obama when he came into office in 2008. Democrats controlled the House and Senate. They did a lot of things and a couple really big things, but it was not smooth sailing. Yeah. It will still be complicated, and Democrats still have the filibuster in the Senate to hold things up.
All right, a who's who of foreign leaders, as is normally the case after there's a new president elected, sent their congratulations to Donald Trump since last night. Among them, the Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, who called Trump, quote, a true friend of Israel. The Russian President Vladimir Putin also expressed a desire to, quote, return Russia and American relations to a stable path of development. The President of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, did not congratulate Trump directly for his victory. Instead, he congratulated the United States more broadly for its, quote, electoral process. Oh. All right, so John, what do you think is going to happen here in the short term as Trump gets started as president-elect and president with his relationships with world leaders?
Well, it all depends, I think, on how Trump handles it. I mean, look, there is no group of people in the world who are more freaked out than the collective Democrats of the 5 boroughs of New York about Donald Trump becoming president, than the collective world leadership. They are all freaked out. And so the question, I think, is going to be, how does Trump go about it? Bibi Netanyahu is a little bit of an outlier. A lot of them are going to come into this very tentative, and so they're going to be looking to see, is Trump trying to take on a statesman like Mien or not? If he does take one on, I think there's a chance that they'll at least be ready to try to work with him. But if Trump behaves in a volatile way, this could be very ugly and very rocky very fast.
I keep coming back to Pence. He's got a great interest in knowledge and foreign policy. I wonder how involved he'll be here. Our last 2 vice presidents were heavily involved in national security and foreign policy. Who's the Secretary of State? Who's the national security advisor? And how much does Trump get involved? I mean, Trump's interested in foreign policy, but I don't think he's like, you know, going to be day-to-day nitty-gritty on all this stuff.
Yeah, there's part of me that thinks that it's still that story we heard back during the nomination fight when there was a leak story about how when they tried to get Kasich to come on the ticket and they said, you'll do foreign policy and domestic policy, and supposedly Donald Trump Jr. said that his dad's role would be making America great again. I think there's probably a little bit of truth to that. He wants to be a chairman.
Foreign policy.
Yeah, right.
All right. We're going to take a break, come back, and talk about the state of the other party, the Democratic Party, following last night's stinging defeat from Hillary Clinton. After these words from our sponsors.
Right up until last night, pretty much everyone thought that it was the Republicans who'd be the ones needing an introspective, soul-searching meditation session about their future of the party after Election Day, or would find themselves engaged in a full-blown civil war. But at this point, if anyone's going to be launching a post-election autopsy or waging internecine warfare in the year ahead, it's going to be the Democrats. Those who faced a colossal defeat last night, not just in the presidential race, but also in key House and Senate contests. So, Mark, we can devote this entire block to this one question. What cometh in the future for the Democrats?
This program and every other political show has devoted months to the ruination of the Republican Party once Trump lost. The Democratic Party at the presidential level now and below is at a world of hurt. They don't control the House or the Senate. They've been wiped out in a lot of states. the Republican governors all over the country, and there's no bench. I mean, the names that get floated for potential 2020, some nice people, they're not well known. They can't raise $1 billion plus. And Hillary Clinton, by moving so far to the left to accommodate Bernie Sanders, I think it just muddled up. What does the party stand for? Chuck Schumer will play a big role here, but he is an inside player. He is not going to be some sort of big national figure. So I think they got to hope that somebody emerges with ideas and style and communication skills. The list is short.
I think that the party, I think the party is, there's not going to be that much internecine warfare, only for this reason. I think Hillary Clinton was the last vestige of Clintonism, to the extent that Clintonism continues to exist at all in any meaningful way as a moderate or centrist force. And I guess you said she got pulled to the left because that's where the party is. This is going to be a left-wing party now, a party of progressivism, unbridled. That's what the Democratic Party has become. Bernie Sanders is going to be a big figure in the party. Elizabeth Warren is going to be a big figure in the party. Cory Booker is going to be a big figure in the party. People who are people of the left. You might say that's a good idea or a bad idea, but I don't think there's going to be some war between a centrist faction and a left faction, because there is not a very strong centrist faction anymore in the Democratic Party.
But you know, somebody like Michael Bennet, just reelected as a senator from Colorado, you know, are there going to be people like that? Are any of the current governors, anybody who's going to run for governor in 2 years? They need people. Centrist, sure. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are too liberal to be dominant figures in American politics. They can't be within the Democratic Party, but dominant figures in American politics. But
I think it's possible either one of them might have beaten Donald Trump in a general election.
Well, maybe, but they need some governors. They need some younger members of Congress who have ideas. Who have ideas, who they're willing to stand and fight, and probably better off if their ideas, they don't need to be left wing or right wing, but they need to be kind of practical and sensible, and maybe even be passed into law.
I think one of the things that may happen with the Democratic Party is that there will be a collective decision that they blew a winnable election because they just simply nominated the one person who couldn't win it. It's Hillary Clinton. She had so much baggage, and that she blew it, and that now that she's out of the way, that they don't really have to think about, they have to do a lot of soul searching here. It's just she was the obvious nominee, but also the wrong nominee.
The big figures in the party on some level are Jerry Brown, John Kerry, Joe Biden, Al Gore, all 70 or close to it, and all who have not helped foster a younger generation. I mean, you always overstate these things, but it's a problem right now.
That's what I say. Look to the women and look to the non-white leaders, people like Cory Booker, people like Joaquin Castro, Julian Castro, people like that. We'll bring in two of our best Bloomberg Politics political reporters to talk about what they heard and saw on election night, and we'll do that right after this.
Welcome back. Joining us now, two women about whom the word superstar can't be used often enough. Our colleagues who have gone through the entire presidential race, covering American presidential politics at the highest level. I'm engaged in Trump-like hyperbole here, but I mean it. Margaret Talv, our senior White House correspondent, been covering the Clinton campaign, is here in New York. Jennifer Jacobs, also in New York, our senior national political reporter who has covered Donald Trump. Incredibly emotional event today here in New York. Hillary Clinton, I was at the event, and a lot of her supporters, particularly the younger ones, in tears over what's happened. Do you have any sense of why Hillary Clinton or Robbie Mook or anyone else in the campaign, why they think she lost?
I think it's a combination of factors, but part of the reason they think that she lost is that it was a change year. She would have been the third term of Obama. I think part of the reason that they know that she lost is that she could never get past that likability and trust problem that hobbled her to begin with. And when you have two candidates who are deeply unliked and one represents change and the other one doesn't, it is very hard to win when you are the one who doesn't. It's also very hard to enthuse black voters when you're not black. It is also very hard to compare yourself to Barack Obama when you're not as charismatic as Barack Obama. And it's very hard to get past an email scandal that hobbled you before you ever got out of the gate.
Tell me about what your experience was of being at the Trump event last night.
Well, it was a long time coming, and so all these people, these fans, were just waiting around, and they thought it was going to be a goodbye, a farewell thing. It was just going to be kind of a thank you for running. They waited and waited and waited. There was an open bar, so some of them were having a good time with the drinks. There was a cake in the shape of Donald Trump. People were just wandering around talking. And then, you know, when Pennsylvania was called, there was a time when the results weren't married. One outlet had called Wisconsin, and another outlet had called Pennsylvania. And so the crowd knew that Trump had won, but it just hadn't been called yet. And so people were just buzzing with excitement. And then once it finally was announced that he had indeed won, lots of emotion, way more emotion than I expected. Lots of tears as well. Just people just crazy pumped up and high-fiving and shooting selfies and just very, very emotional. And a lot of them that I spoke to said they were stunned. They were not expecting this, and they said they blamed us. They said, you know, the dishonest media had told them,
you in particular,
me in particular, had told them that he could not win, and so they were not expecting this. I don't think there was anyone in that room who thought that was going to happen. Emboldened
by that big victory, you could have imagined a much different speech. You could have imagined a much more confrontational, defiant speech. Why did he go with such a? I'm not criticizing it, but why not take his big victory and talk about the wall and the banning, immigration ban? Why did he go so soft? He's talked about unity on the campaign trail for a really long time, even back since his Iowa days. It's just been a theme. He's wanted to see himself as somebody who can bring everyone together, and that was just one particular theme that he chose to use. And his strategist said that theme wasn't any different than what he's been saying all along. It's just that's who he is.
One of the things that we noted at this event that Hillary Clinton did, Mark said he was there and we were talking about it after, was just the grief of a lot of the folks who were there, particularly the female supporters who really felt crushed. Talk about what you sensed among that cohort who were supporters of hers.
That's right. Last night at the Clinton event was almost like the inverse of what you've just described, obviously. So I would say there were a couple different groups in that audience. One were the people who were diehard Hillary Clinton supporters. Many of the other people were not diehard Hillary Clinton supporters. Some of them maybe began as Bernie Sanders supporters, Elizabeth Warren supporters, but were so angry with Donald Trump and the groups that he had sort of called out and disenfranchised, Muslims, gay Americans, women, immigrants, what have you, that they saw a Clinton win as a repudiation, a snuffing out of Trump's tactics. And when they lost, and they didn't see it coming, all of that was upside down, and there was a fear, a just inability to come to terms with what had happened. They could not believe what was happening.
We have interviewed, as you have all along the way, her team and talked to them about the pressure of potentially losing to Donald Trump. And to a person, they said, we cannot lose to Donald Trump. The responsibility we have. Do you get the sense that people like Robbie Mook, Jennifer Palmieri, Christina Reynolds, the others, are they going to stay involved in politics, or is this going to be a scarring experience for them?
I actually think most of them will stay involved in politics, and I think this will double, maybe triple their resolve. But look, this is a devastating loss, not just for Hillary Clinton, who it's really, I mean, I think a third time would probably be too much, right? Not just for Bill Clinton and the Clinton legacy, but because this is Barack Obama's legacy that is now in jeopardy. Not only because she was supposed to inherit it, but because he doubled down. He put all of his chips in her basket. Joe Biden got out of the way. She was supposed to be the heir to all of that.
That decision
and now
by President Obama to talk Biden out of the race looms large for a lot of people now.
A lot of what ifs being asked today.
Some of them probably in the Biden household. Let me ask you this. You're looking, as we discussed earlier, a little bit about what the Trump administration might look like. I know you've been reporting on that today. Just give us a couple little nuggets about what you're hearing about who might do what.
Well, they met today, and they're just talking about what next steps to take. They have not really planned on who will do what. My understanding is that no real names for administration, members will be announced until next week. And Trump just didn't have time or the energy. He didn't want to waste the money on a transition. They just really shelved this. And so their transition and all their plans for the next few weeks were kind of half-baked. So today was just about regrouping and trying to figure out what they're going to do.
We saw something just get floated just real quick. Reince Priebus, possibly as chief of staff, White House chief of staff. That just popped up this afternoon.
Heard some other names as well. Yes.
Yeah.
I will say one name. The political obits for Chris Christie were being bandied about for weeks, particularly after the Bridgegate verdicts. And I made some eye contact with him last night, and he just looked like the happiest guy in the room, except for Trump. I think now he's going to get a huge job, right?
But Newt Gingrich wasn't on stage. I'm not sure why.
Well, Rudy wasn't either and came up belatedly. I think maybe it just wasn't like the strictest of choreography. I will say again, in all seriousness, you two had incredible cycles covering this race, and we're really proud and happy to have you here today and have been with you side by side throughout the cycle. So thank you.
I want to get Margaret back on the show soon because I really want to talk to you about what Barack Obama is thinking right now, given what's happened.
We're going to do a whole hour on that. All right, Jennifer Jacobs, Margaret Talib, thank you both. We come back. Mark McKinnon, Bill Burton are going to talk about last night and what lies ahead for both parties right after this.
Joining us now from Santa Barbara, California, Democratic strategist and former Deputy White House Press Secretary Bill Burton in a fetching pair of new glasses. And here in the studio in an always fetching new or even old hat, a man whose smile and twinkling blue eyes are what's called equal parts charm and mischief. Political media strategist and co-creator, co-host, and co-executive producer of The Circus, Mark McKinnon. Bill, I'll start with you with the question I was going to ask Margaret if we hadn't run out of time. You know President Obama pretty well. He devoted a lot of time, effort, and energy to trying to pick up Hillary Clinton on his big, broad shoulders politically and drag her across the finish line. Did not work. So now it seems like everything that he accomplished in the last 8 years is in jeopardy. How do you think he's thinking and feeling about that?
Well, I mean, he's obviously quite disappointed in the outcome of this election. He knew that Hillary Clinton would be a great president and, would also help to carry on some of the things that he had been working on. But, look, I think that the one thing that we all know is that the electorate is a much different thing than we all thought it was yesterday morning when we woke up. And there's so much anger out there and, such a feeling of inattentiveness to what's causing that anger that Democrats are going to have to do some real soul searching to figure out what's our way forward here.
But just specifically, Bill, here's President Obama. Right now, they're already, Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, they're already talking about first thing out of the gate in January, repeal Obamacare. That must be a chilling thing for Barack Obama to hear that.
Yeah, look, nobody wants that. And for the Americans who would lose health care as a result of that, or would lose access to important to health care at all because they have pre-existing conditions or things like that, I think that people are very concerned about it. But President Obama is especially concerned about it. That's why he passed the law. That's why he signed it into law. And, it's true that it did have some problems, but the problems can be fixed and people don't have to lose their health care. But I think that, Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump are going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it's going to leave millions of Americans out in the cold.
If you assume that part of what's going on in the Republican Party now is populist anger at the way elites behave, that they're not fighting enough, you got the Bushes. They don't endorse Donald Trump, and then he gets elected, so they're angry about that. And then Trump gets elected, and all of a sudden they're saying, oh, we're really supporting Donald Trump. We hope he does well. Doesn't that just make people cynical about elites?
It makes them, sure, it makes them cynical about elites, but what I'm really struck by is that of course, we have the shock and surprise of the election itself, but one of the things that everybody talked about was, probably that Trump was going to lose, but they talked a lot about the disarray of the Republican Party. 24 hours later, today, the Republican Party is in better shape than it's been since 1928. Yeah. We have all three branches of government suddenly for the first time in almost 100 years. So
winning will do that.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think about the kind of Republican Party it's going to be because it's anti-trade, pro-entitlements. I guess there's going to be a big infrastructure bill. That's one thing they seem to agree on. So it's kind of a big spending agenda in a way. And I'm interested to see how long that's popular with the rank and file, because I remember how that went south on Bush when he did, for example, the drug prescriptions.
Bill, if you were to call together 3 or 4 or 5 big Democratic thinkers, strategists, elected officials, whatever, to say we need to chart a new course for a national Democratic Party brand with ideas and themes, who are some people you'd bring in the room besides yourself?
Well, I would start with my colleagues Anita Dunn and Hillary Rosen, and I would probably add in Van Jones, and I would add in
any elected officials who you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say red state Democrats.
There aren't very many of them.
The new governor of the new governor of North Carolina. I think that we need to be attentive to the fact that there's a lot of we have a big problem with middle-class white voters that we haven't been paying attention to, and the Obama coalition is never going to be the Obama coalition again. So we need to grow our share of the electorate. That has to include more middle-class white voters. We've got to be focused on that. So those are the sort of folks I'd bring in. Steve Shale would be good down in Florida.
I thought I was hearing that 24 hours ago from the Republican Party.
Let me ask you this. I mentioned before that there's a little bit of an irony. You run as a populist outsider candidate, and then you get to move to Washington, D.C. if you win, and you get to be the head of the federal government. How does that tension play itself out when you've got Donald Trump having ridden in on that particular rhetorical and substantive horse, arriving there, trying to keep the faith with the people who voted him in as an outsider who wants to blow up the Capitol? Now he's got to run it, and he's got to run it with some real establishmentarians like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. How does that work out?
Well, that's the real trick, and I think you've got to watch the body language very closely over the next couple of weeks, particularly with Paul Ryan. I mean, what's going to make or break this first 100 days will be the relationship between Paul Ryan and Donald Trump.
Bill, I mentioned before this notion of normalizing Trump and how a lot of your colleagues and maybe you criticized people in the press and some Republicans and said, you can't treat him like a normal person. Well, now he's president-elect. He's being greeted at the White House tomorrow by President Obama. Are Democrats now required, or are they obligated to basically treat him like a normal president-elect for the foreseeable future?
Well, I think any normal Republican president elect would be treated with some level of scrutiny by Democrats, and I certainly think that that's true of Donald Trump. You know, I think he's going to do his best to normalize himself the same way, you know, I was in college in Minnesota when Jesse Ventura was elected governor, and I think he did a good job of trying to take the job seriously for a while and then spectacularly failed. But Donald Trump, for the moment, will do his best to you know, do all the stuff that a normal president-elect will do, but Democrats will be tough.
Let me give you a practical example. We've got this ongoing suit related to Trump University. Should Democratic interest groups and operatives and members of Congress, should they be jumping all over that and saying Donald Trump is corrupt and, you know, irresponsible and treats the little gal bad, or should they give him a honeymoon?
I don't think anybody deserves a honeymoon necessarily. I think that Donald Trump, if he broke the law, should be held accountable, and that includes Trump University. I think that the FBI is still looking into Russian ties to his campaign. The IRS is certainly looking into his foundation. There's going to be a lot of questions, and there's certainly going to be a rough patch for the Trump presidency.
You think Democrats should be doing opposition research on that and pushing it all out there and trying to hurt him politically even now? I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm just asking you what your posture is.
Right. Well, I'm not saying necessarily hurt him politically. If he broke the law, then he should be held into account. And if he skirted IRS rules, then he should certainly be penalized.
But Bill, in the real world,
I
understand. But in the real world, Democrats can spend their time trying to fan the flames of that stuff, peddle stuff to reporters the way been going on during the campaign, or they can say, well, that stuff can take care of itself. We're going to focus on trying to find common ground with President Trump.
You say in the real world, but you're not talking about the real world. You're talking about Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C., politics happens every single day. And I think that if laws are broken, people should be held into account. And I think that that will certainly be the case for President-elect Donald Trump when the chips fall in some of these investigations that are probably happening behind the scenes that we haven't heard about so that they didn't interfere with the election.
Do you think he gets a honeymoon? Just as a matter of fact, will he get the customary kind of honeymoon, at least a short variety that most presidents get when they first arrive?
Not much, only in the sense that where there's, I think the infrastructure bill is one opportunity, and it's a big one, and it's a significant one.
I think corporate tax reform, too.
Yeah, right. So I think there will be, just in the sense that, you know, I know just from the work I've done in kind of the nonprofit sector with groups like No Labels over the last few years, at this point in this country, and I think this is part of what they said about Donald Trump, is we don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican. We just want to get some problems solved. So I think there's a lot of that at play. I think members are kind of getting that message, and I give it till Christmas.
Can I just add on to what Mark's saying there? Because I think what we saw in this election is that, like I was saying before, Democrats have a real problem with certain segments of voters. If Democrats are seen to be just being obstructionists and just causing gridlock in Washington, voters, America's not necessarily going to like that.
Right.
I think that if there are legitimate questions to be asked, they should be asking them. But if there's progress that can be made, Democrats ought to be looking for ways to get aid to some of those folks out there who don't feel like they're getting enough attention of the people in Washington.
Bill, let me ask you this one more question. Starting in January, you won't have the White House, you won't have the speakership or the majority leader slot. We don't know who the chair of the DNC is going to be. Who should be the leading spokesperson for the Democratic Party come January, if you could designate someone?
Well, I think Nancy Pelosi has a very strong voice, and she will certainly be out there. And you'll have a whole coterie of Democrats who are out there speaking for the party. But, you know, this is going to be a moment of Democrats figuring this out, and you'll see a lot of people acting as spokesperson. Everybody from Kamala Harris, who was just elected to the Senate from California, to Kirsten Gillibrand in New York, to people across the country. So I think we're going to be auditioning a lot of different people to be the spokesperson for the party, and that's going to go on for a good 4 years.
All right, Bill, I'm going to make a point of not telling Chuck Schumer that you didn't mention him on that list, because if he heard that, he'd come all the way out there. And
it was a mistake. I meant to say Chuck Schumer first. I totally meant to say Chuck Schumer first. He's welcome to come to Santa Barbara, though.
I don't want to send him out there wringing your neck. Bill Burton, Mark McKinnon, great Americans, both. Thank you. Just remember, you can watch McKinnon and me and Mark Halpern on The Circus, our Showtime documentary series produced in conjunction with Bloomberg Politics. The finale, the grand finale, airs this Sunday at 8 p.m.
You won't want to miss it.
Do not miss it. Spoiler alert, it deals with the election. When we come back, we will talk more about what the media missed during this wild election cycle. And if you happen to be watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Over the course of this election, Donald J. Trump's candidacy has been nothing but front and center, and yet, at the very same time, his Oval Office prospects were, as you all know, sometimes minimized by people in the media. Here to talk about what he's calling a, quote, Dewey defeats Truman lesson for the digital age, the vaunted media columnist for the New York Times, James Rutenberg. He joins us from the Times newsroom. There's so many questions we want to ask you. Let me start with this. I traveled with the Trump campaign covering the last weekend, and they threw all the rules out. There were no access, basically, of an ordinary nature to just the general flow of information. There's lots of discussion, and well documented by you and others. What leverage would the American media have, the White House Correspondents Association, to have Donald Trump play by the normal rules, not to benefit the media, but to benefit the public interest?
I don't think they have any. They don't have any leverage.
It's a problem.
They don't, but you know, I'm old enough to remember, cough, cough, that the George W. Bush years when a lot of media outlets, including this one, were shut out, especially from Vice President Dick Cheney. But you know, we're talking about a candidate, a president-elect who's talked about kind of getting rid of the White House press room, hasn't he? So there's no, I don't know where we may be heading into uncharted territory.
Jim, there's been a lot of criticism of a lot of things that a lot of people in the press have done over the course of Donald Trump's candidacy. Which of those criticisms do you think, pick a couple that you think have real merit, and then tell us what the lessons are out of those.
I'll start with the short-term merit is the reliance, which we've talked about before, the over-reliance on data crunching and polling led people to discount his chances even more, confirmation bias. So then that led to a less serious kind of coverage of his candidacy. We've talked about that. I think the most substantive thing, and it's kind of the hardest to rectify, but it's the most important to rectify, is the disconnect between the National Press Corps and a huge percentage of the country that voted for Donald J. Trump. And they don't understand his supporters. They don't get why his supporters don't seem to be reacting to some of the journalism they've done. But they've got to get over it. They've got to cover this part of the country and understand it much better.
So those are all things in the context of covering a presidential campaign. If the Washington bureau chiefs of all the big organizations invited you in and said, Jim, what do we need to gear up for to do our jobs the right way for covering President Trump? What are the things you'd ask them to focus on?
I think you'd look at, so now we're going to a place where legislation is going to happen and policy is going to be enacted. So if we're talking about a wall, let's be sure that we're on top of what these Congress members are going to hear, even moderate Congress members on the Republican side, when they come back to their districts and maybe they're a little less into the wall, or they're getting pressure from the special interests they've been working with for so long not to build a wall. So it's kind of, remember the healthcare kind of crazy town hall meetings during Obamacare? Like we missed that story then, but you know, we've missed a lot of these because we weren't on the ground at the town hall meetings. Some of it's kind of basic, but now it comes to the Hill, but the Hill is going to be reacting to public pressure that's going to be immense to get behind his agenda.
Okay, Jim Rutenberg, New York Times. Jim, thanks. We're going to talk to you a lot, I predict, over the coming weeks and months. We'll be right back.
we go, a little shout out to a big league viewer, Jonathan Heron's 1-year-old son. Thanks for watching, buddy, and remember what I said about the coalition of the Ascendant. We have more coverage on BloombergPolitics.com. Coming up on Bloomberg Technology, the partner of Khosla Ventures, the CEO of Reddit, and the CEO of Crowdpack all talk about what a Trump presidency will mean for the technology world. Until tomorrow, from me and my friend Mark right here in Gotham City, we say to you, sayonara.